Welcome back to our special bulletin review, Modernizing Federal Government Planning, sponsored by Decision Lens, here on Federal News Network. My guest today is Jonathan Allen, Executive Vice President of Strategic Markets at Decision Lens. I'm Tom Temin. And before the break, you were making the analogy of the smartphone ecosystem, if you will, to the flip phone that did one or two things, or the BlackBerry, and the Palm does one or two things. So maybe just elaborate on how the Palm and the PPBE can be expanded to be more effective, to be more efficient in a way that you can bring in other non-stovepipe types of applications into it.
Yeah, Tom, I think a lot of our listeners know and understand that in our day and age, with many of the government processes, they're using spreadsheets and PowerPoint slides a lot of the time to manage those processes. And I would liken that to the flip phone, of a past time period. There are many organizations that are using SharePoint and other kinds of tools to create an environment where they can collaborate on that data and use that going forward. And I would liken that to the BlackBerry age, the PDA. But there are organizations now that are starting to use a more centralized planning solution that is continuous in nature, as you use that word continuous. And I think that's similar to maybe what we now have in our smartphones. And the reason why I use that analogy is because today on our smartphones we can do so much more than just calling, texting, and emailing. Today in the planning cycle of the government, there are a lot of organizations that can do so much more than just managing, organizing, and collecting data for decision-making purposes. There are so many things with machine learning and AI that they could do if they were able to be into a system and set of technologies that allows for them to go ahead and do that.
I guess in some sense, then, the way you describe it, then the PPBE, and the Palm become less of a stovepipe over here exercise that we have to do, and much more integrated into the reality of the changing and shifting requirements DoD actually faces.
In the accelerating environment that we're in, yes. I think what's happening is, the processes themselves are not wrong. There will always be planning processes over certain time periods and time horizons. But our ability to use those processes with the latest technology and the latest best practices and processes, I think can change and will change over time.
And talk more about the artificial intelligence, machine learning piece of this. Everybody's talking about those two things.
Right.
How can it be brought into the PPBE?
Sure. So artificial intelligence and machine learning can be used in a lot of different environments. When it comes to the planning processes within government, there's a lot of power in being able to not only plan and forecast and project on certain targets, like in the military, say, readiness or lethality of the force or other kinds of things like that. And then to be able to track in those planning processes and those projects, how did we do? And what's powerful about this is, from a machine learning and AI perspective, not only can we use genetic algorithms to make recommendations about the projects that will drive readiness or drive lethality or these other performance targets, but we can also create a continuous planning cycle so that it can inform future projects based on the historical data that we have. In other words, the portfolio of projects can become smarter and smarter based on the historical data that we're collecting and gathering over time. And it can really help make recommendations to leaders about what they should do.
And not only that, then, it sounds also as if it can make the recommendations the leaders have to appropriators more credible, more convincing, and therefore more effective.
That's exactly right. We talk about data-driven decision-making, and I think there is a lot of data-driven decision-making across the government, and there's some very, very intelligent people that are doing that. And we can make technology help us do that better and better in the examples that we were just talking about.
Now, earlier you mentioned the 3 Ds of data: disconnected nature of it that's required in the whole budgeting process, the delay, sometimes we don't have the most current data to do planning by, and it can change in a matter of hours in some cases, and then the disparateness of the data, the different formats and so forth. How do you bring that all together in an automated way that really helps some of these benefits to the planning process we've been talking about?
So let me give you one other example of a client that we're working with, and this is just one example of others that we could use, but Army Training and Doctrine Command is one of the major commands in the Army, and they asked us to help them. One of the things that they were dealing with in their budgeting and execution processes, they had a very large unfunded requirement process where they collect unfunded requirements from the centers of excellence across that particular command. And they also were struggling with the budgeting and the planning. In other words, the way they build the requirements for next year's budget year, and then they execute on those requirements within the command. They had, I think, 17 different spreadsheets that they were collecting the data on, and then they had to pull that data together. And as you can imagine, in terms of the data disconnectedness, a lot of version control issues, a lot of other kinds of things. And we're chuckling about this, Tom, because we know that there are a lot of listeners out there that are living and breathing this today. And again, it's not any fault of their own. It's just the nature of the complexity of the organization, in terms of dealing with this. So what we did is we started to work with them to first collect and organize their data in a way that could be transparent and defensible, and then to prioritize those requirements in a meaningful way. And something really powerful started to happen. You had what they call the G357, which is the planning part of the organization, and the G8, which is the resource requirements part of the organization, started to see more visibly and clearly what was on those requirements, what the priorities were, how those were changing over time. So it gave them the single sheet of music, if you will, to be able to operate off of. And it helped not only with the disconnectedness, but with the delay, and then the disparities of the different data coming from different systems. And so that's just one example of how that works.
And in that whole spreadsheet idea, as someone who doesn't know a pivot table from a coffee table, I imagine when you can get away from that kind of dependence, then more people can contribute meaningfully to this process, including the people that know the reality, but may not know the data access and spreadsheet issues.
That's right. There are a lot of really intelligent analysts that are out there, and they're building successful spreadsheets. The challenge is if they move on to another job or if they retire, then that leaves sometimes a lack of continuity in terms of what needs to happen. But I would say more importantly than that, Tom, are the requirements that we're building and prioritizing really getting at the effectiveness of the overall mission? That's the real key that the question that we're trying to answer.
Yeah, so maybe elaborate on that. How does it help the mission? I mean, that's ultimately what this is all about.
Well, I mentioned earlier there's this example of maybe funding something that's easier to fund. You can obligate the funds more quickly to do that. We kind of sometimes joke, maybe that's the office furniture in the organization as opposed to a really important mission-related requirement. But let me just give you a couple of quick examples of organizations that we know that we're working with. One is a DoD, and another I'll use is a federal civilian agency. So in the Department of Defense space, we work with organizations such as one that is dealing with the mobility of the forces, right? They're working to mobilize troops and to mobilize other weapon systems, airplanes and things. And one of the things that they deal with is how do we make sure that we're training our pilots and our engineers effectively, and at the same time responding to the needed exercises and the mobilization and the missions that are going on out there. It's very difficult for them to plan in that environment just because of the complexity of it. But again, if you have a planning system that's tied to those readiness requirements and those other requirements, then you can start to make decisions around that. In federal civilian, National Park Service uses our software and our services to really understand contaminated sites. So how do we clean up contaminated sites? And how do we prioritize those so that we're doing that in the most efficient and the most effective way? So if the decision focus is on where the mission is and a line of sight to the overall strategy, then it allows the resources to be tied to that. And I think that's the key in decision making.
And you've started to answer one question I had. This whole automation and intelligence-based process to budget planning and execution is applicable in civilian side also.
Absolutely. You know, there are civilian agencies that use and call it the PPBE process. Others don't call it that, but they still have the same kind of long range, mid range, and then near term planning cycles that they're going through. And they all need to allocate resources in the most effective way. So it applies there as well.
I guess if this could all add up to Congress doing its appropriations on time, it would seem like nirvana.
That's right. It is a major challenge that we know many deal with in terms of the continuing resolution, and then trying to figure out how do we allocate our funds as quickly as possible for the remaining 6 months of the execution.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's not only getting your money beyond when you thought you would need it, but also how to accelerate the effective use of it without just throwing it around because the fiscal year is only 6 months long.
That's exactly right.
All right, and so what's your best advice then for agencies that look at their budget process and how much time they spend spinning wheels to start getting started on a way to do this more efficiently?
So what I would say to leaders in a leadership role, let's say maybe it's a director of planning and programming or a commander or some other kind of leader that's looking at their planning processes, is to take a hard look at what they're doing from a planning perspective and to try to understand the answer to a couple of these questions. One is the data that I'm pulling in, can I see it clearly, and is it pointed towards key decision points that we have? And then, of course, you know, is there a line of sight to the overall strategy? There are processes and technologies that can enable that. What I would say to analysts or those who are out on the front lines, you know, working these processes, you know, how can you automate and streamline the processes that you're dealing with in a way that would allow you and those around you to be more effective in what you're doing? And the power of that is it can allow analysts to then spend more time analyzing the data and doing what they do really, really well, which is understand that data and be able to provide actionable insights, as opposed to you know, putting the data in, pulling it out, and kind of, you know, wrangling the data the whole time.
All right, great discussion. Thank you so much. I want to thank today's guest. Jonathan Allen is the Executive Vice President of Strategic Markets at Decision Lens. I'm Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, please visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Decision Lens.